there are a plethora of journalists and doctors and scientists on YouTube and influencers as well, who don't have any special credentials, who are telling us that saturated fat is not a problem. They point to the change in the nutrition guidelines in 1980 and that diabetes and obesity and stuff started going up at the same time that we started cutting down on saturated fats. So clearly saturated fat is bad, right? Obviously, when the dietary recommendations that we were given, where grains were the base and the thing that we should eat the most of, and the thing at the top was like oils and meat and dairy, and then we had above grains we had vegetables, and there were fruits and nuts and legumes and so on. So clearly that shift from the way we had been eating was a bad decision. Right? Well, the thing that you have to understand is that when you're listening to somebody talk about nutrition, you have to look at the fact of whether they are a nutritionist or an epidemiologist or a researcher or someone who does clinical trials, or what their credentials are. So let me put it to you a different way. If you had a brain tumor, would you go to a podiatrist, a foot doctor, to have that fixed? No, you definitely would not. So you wouldn't, by the same token, go to a journalist like Nina Teicholz or Gary Taubes to ask them about nutrition, because they're not experts in the field. They don't have the background. They don't have the knowledge. And now I'm just assuming good faith here, okay? I'm not accusing them of anything, although I have very strong opinions on a lot of those people. So when you listen to X. Stenberg or Ken Berry or Jason Fung or Sean Baker, Peter Attia, Andrew Huberman, Joe Rogan, and all these other people, they are talking about things on which they are not experts. Now, you're going to say, Glenn, you're not an expert. No, I'm not. However, I am smart, and I do research. I do look into the science. And so I see things that other people aren't going to see. Unfortunately, and I'm not trying to be egotistical here, but unfortunately, not everybody got the right kind of education that will help them to sort these things out. Not everybody got the education that would allow them to analyze and research and problem solve and troubleshoot and be a critical thinker. Fortunately, because of my education in programming, I have those skills, and they have aided me in many, many different ways in my life, including fighting phobias. I had 4. Now I have just a little bit more than 0, because one of them is very difficult, especially when people take a syringe and they wiggle it around trying to get my vein. That always just that's too much. So I've been able to figure out why, for example, why was I having pain in my stomach that I never felt before in my life. It was overconsumption of high cacao chocolate that had also had a lot of salt in it. When I had a lot of problems in Indonesia, where I was having problems with diarrhea every day. I'm not going to go into details. And I had multiple wounds that were not healing. I had an ear infection in both ears that it took over a year to get rid of. And other things at all the same time. And the doctor said, yeah, you've irritated they did an endoscopy and a colonoscopy, and they discovered my intestines were irritated. I had what is it? Well, anyways, my intestines were irritated. It produced colitis. My stomach was irritated. And I was like, what the heck? I figured it out, though. I had been dry swallowing 2 allergy medications without having food and beverage prior to them. And over a period of time, that resulted in irritating my entire digestive system. Another time, I started having problems with my heart, hypertension, palpitations, arrhythmia, and eventually angina. And I started doing research, and it took me over a year. Why? Because almost nobody was talking about the role of salt in causing damage to the circulatory system. But eventually, when I realized that the common factor, once I ruled out other things that seemed to be contributing but were not consistent, was salt. And when I cut down on salt, all of those things decreased. I went from having mildly painful angina daily, multiple palpitations, like sometimes every hour, and so on and so forth, to rarely. My angina almost never happens now. And that was because I researched and I figured it out. When I was a young man, from the time I was a young boy until I was a young man, I had a lot of problems with insomnia. I figured out how to beat it. So, when I was a young man, I developed my own system of hypnotism. I'm not stupid. I'm not an expert. I defer to the experts. But I can tell the difference between a doctor or a scientist or a journalist or a regular person who's out to get money by what they say and what they're selling. And I mean literally sometimes what they're selling. So, is saturated fat the culprit? I mean, the absence of saturated fat. Well, if we go back to the 1970s when the committee was doing research on this and talking to experts, including Ancel Keys, who was frequently reviled by some people these days, and they asked all these experts, these researchers, they looked at all the data, and they came up with a plan to reduce meat consumption. And the meat lobby got so angry about it that they put so much money into fighting this change that it was changed to saturated fat. Why saturated fat? It was a compromise. They didn't mention meat specifically, but meat has saturated fat. Some of the worst meat to eat for your health is Wagyu. But even worse than Wagyu is processed meat. Now, in a way, Wagyu is processed meat because it's incredibly unnaturally high in fat. Now, not all saturated fats are equal. So, for example, trans fats are the worst. Now, you'll hear some influencers lying about that. But trans fats are the worst, and then animal fats are the second worst, including dairy. And then we get into like palm and coconut. Well, coconut's a kind of a palm, but palm and coconut, they have been shown to have a bad impact on the circulatory system and stuff. And then we get into some of the others. And there are some fats that are much better for us than others. But if you have a diet that's high in fat and you have the wrong genetics, you're dooming yourself. And the problem is that most people don't have the right digestion, the right genetics to be able to live on a high-fat diet. There are some people, there are some societies where that is definitely possible. But there are a whole lot of other things that are included that help to mitigate the impact of saturated fats, of meat. So they talk about, diabetes isn't really from sugar. That's the sugar lobby talking. They say meat doesn't cause diabetes. That's the meat industry talking. They make huge sums of money off of the murder of animals. They don't want to have to change their ways. The sugar industry basically exists on slave wages in most places. They don't want to have to treat their employees right. In fact, the meat industry is guilty of employing a lot of illegal aliens and legal aliens and then screwing them over when they get injured. That sounds like me and one of my former employers. Anyways, so if it isn't meat and saturated fat being reduced in the diet, or more specifically, because meat was swept under the rug, if it wasn't saturated fat that was the problem, or rather the lack of saturated fat, then what was the problem? That's a really good question. And if you do the research and you look carefully, you'll notice that in order to make low-fat food taste good, manufacturers had to change their recipes. And guess what they did? To make their food taste better, they added more sugar and more salt. And at the same time that this was all going on, because the meat lobby had successfully won against that committee, meat consumption was driven up. Do you remember? Where's the beef? That was an old Wendy's commercial with a little old lady asking where the beef was because she had some tiny little burger that barely had any meat in it. And people were like, yeah, where is the beef? I want a thick beef burger. I don't want this tiny little patty. And, then there's Chick-fil-A with the chicken and all these other companies. And they just kept on piling it on. And restaurant eating shifted from mostly quality restaurants to mostly fast food restaurants. From restaurants that focused more on fruits and vegetables and grains to restaurants that focused more heavily on meat. So, sugar and salt play a heavy role in the reason Americans and Britons and many other people in other countries that have similar diets to ours are struggling with diabetes, with hypertension, with strokes, with heart attacks, and so on. Now, in America, a lot of the cancer we have is because of the Manhattan Project and all the testing of nuclear bombs. But that's off the subject. So, what Nina Teicholz never talks about when she criticizes Ancel Keys, and what Gary Taubes never says when he criticizes Ancel Keys, and what are Ken Berry and all these other influencers fail to mention is salt and sugar. In fact, they deny that there's any problem with them most of the time. They deny that there's anything wrong with meat. Now, you can draw whatever conclusions you want about that and why they're doing it. I'm not going to be the one who's pointing the gun. There are lots of people out there who are smarter than I am who have directly addressed this issue. And they have made it quite obvious what these people are doing. What I'm just trying to do here is to get you to understand that a low amount of saturated fat in your diet is not a bad thing. It's when you compensate by using too much salt and sugar that it becomes a problem because you want it to taste good. And in fact, most Americans eat way too much of both. You can try to blame it on carbs, you can try to blame it on grains, and in some cases, yes, some people can exist and even thrive on fat or even thrive on meat. Some people can actually thrive on a low-carb diet, but the majority of people do not have the right genetics. Paul Saladino used to be a carnivore. He's not anymore. Why? Because his health got so bad he had to stop being a carnivore. He still eats meat, but he's eating a more balanced diet. Now, he doesn't talk about that much, but he has admitted it. But he still promotes meat. He still promotes the wrong thing. So it's really simple. If you want better health, eat smaller portions, eat more grains, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, and fruits. Eat less dairy and meat, with the exception of non-predatory fish. Like salmon is a great option as long as you can get it from a source that they actually are raising them correctly so they're not polluted. But predatory fish are a problem because they bioaccumulate a lot of toxins like mercury, DDT, PCBs, and now PFAS, the forever chemical, thanks to Dow and these other companies that decided to lie to us about Teflon. Cut down on your sugar. Use sucralose or erythritol. Now, erythritol is not a strongly sweet thing. Pure sucralose is extremely strong, and it is also quite bitter, even in a small quantity. For a 2-cup beverage, I will use 1/40th of a teaspoon. But those are really great choices. Stevia, monk's fruit, if you can find them pure, they're very expensive, but they're also great choices. Monk's fruit is also called Lohan Guo. That's the Chinese name for it. And there are a small number of other ones that are great choices, and even some of the artificial sweeteners are great. Stop avoiding gluten unless you have definitely been able to discover that you have a gluten intolerance, which is at the extreme level called celiac disease, because you actually need gluten if you do not have an intolerance. Stop eating dairy unless you really, stop eating dairy, or at least cut down. Look, I'm not saying you have to become a vegetarian. I'm not saying you have to become a vegan. I'm saying that you need to decrease saturated fats, sugar, salt, meat, dairy, fast food, and junk food, and increase the good stuff, the vegetables and fruits, the produce, all the plant stuff. Now, believe it or not, you can actually make tofu taste really, really good. There are simple recipes out there that simulate the flavor of chicken, for example. I've tried them. Now, they are a bit high in sodium, so I don't eat them, but they are good. There are lots of other ways to make it taste good. There are soups out there that soak into the tofu and make it taste so flavorful. Now, they are slow cook recipes, but get yourself a slow cooker. That's fine. You don't have to read every little detail, but you do have to start paying attention to nutrition and stop listening to the influencers who are getting rich off of your lack of knowledge, because they don't care if you get sick. They don't care if you die. They only care that you give them their money, either directly or indirectly. I hope this has helped you to understand that there's no simple answers here. There are a lot of different kinds of people with a lot of different kinds of genetics. Some people have problems where eating a lot of meat and dairy and beer causes them to get gout. And there are a lot of other people who don't have that problem. But if you cut back on alcohol as well, that's a good choice. Now, a while back, Dr. Spector on Zoe Science and Nutrition claimed that everybody should be drinking 5 cups of coffee. Now, 5 cups of coffee, 1 cup of coffee has approximately 80 milligrams of caffeine. So 8 times 5 is 400 milligrams of caffeine. That is the maximum that humans are supposed to consume in one day. And for many people, including myself, it will cause nausea, palpitations, confusion, sweating, and nervousness, and a lot of other nasty side effects. And I greatly resent that Dr. Spector did that. It was very irresponsible of him. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. I need to ask for your help. On December 11th, 2024, Amazon fired me under false pretenses. And on the 17th, I had surgery for the injury that occurred at Amazon that Amazon and Sedgwick refused to take responsibility for. So it's coming out of my pocket and my insurance company's pocket. So that means I'm unemployed and I will not be getting short-term disability from Amazon or from Sedgwick. So my financial situation is a bit of a problem right now. If you would like to help me, there are some things you can do. Number one, you can like, subscribe, share, comment, and turn on notifications on my channels. Number two, if you'd like to give a one-time donation, and please don't do this if you can't afford it, you can, on the Glenn's Fast Reviews channel, do a super thanks. Number three, if you would like to help me on a monthly basis, you can become a member on Glenn's Fast Reviews, and or you can go to patreon.com/GLENNMII and become a member there. Thank you so much for your support.